Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned for the Edgar Rice Burroughs Show. It's the Edgar Rice Burroughs Show once again, where we are going to be talking about a movie. We're going to be talking about the 2012 Disney version of A Princess of Mars, which they titled, boringly, John Carter. So we're going to be talking about the John Carter movie. I feel like it's finally time. I should probably talk about this movie and my thoughts about this movie. Being a lifelong, practically, John Carter of Mars fan, what did I think of this movie? John Carter from 2012. Well, I had been looking forward to this movie a long time. This movie came out 100 years after the story was first published. So it took a long time to get this to the film, to the movies. And I always thought when I was originally reading these stories back in the 80s that you could never put this series on film. It would be impossible to do it right. Because those were the days of practical effects before CGI. And back in those days, I just couldn't imagine that you could pull this off realistically. But finally, we can now put an actual version of this story on the screen. But did they? Well, I went to see this movie very excited, and then I saw the movie, and well, I had mixed feelings. I do think that this movie is better than it usually gets credit for. I think there are a lot of people that feel that way, that this movie is better than the reputation that this movie has. This movie was a huge flop. It just bombed at the box office terribly. And that is what it is known for. It is known for tanking at the box office. Why did it fail so badly if it's, not actually a bad movie? Well, it wasn't a great movie, first of all. That just has to be admitted, I think. There were issues with pacing. There was issues with the story. There were a lot of issues that this film had, even though, it wasn't bad. It wasn't great, really. And also the marketing was terrible. Most people think that this movie failed because of the marketing. And that's certainly partially true. I think, well, you can go right from the title, John Carter. I heard at the time that they didn't call it John Carter of Mars because there was some other movie Disney had made, I think, with Mars in the title, and it failed. So because they're geniuses, they thought, well, if we put Mars in the title of this movie, it'll fail. Well, it failed anyway. You just give it a title like John Carter. If you don't know who John Carter of Mars is, you're going to have no idea what this movie is about. It's just, is this a biography of somebody named John Carter? What is this? Nobody knew who John Carter was. And so the title was bad. And the marketing was strange. It wasn't well marketed. The trailers weren't great. And they didn't try very hard, Disney. I think Disney knew that this was going to fail. I think that the feeling at Disney was, we spent a ton of money on this movie, and it's not going to do well. This movie sucks, and it's going to fail. So why should we spend any more money on this movie? Especially since in 2012, Disney bought Star Wars. And they knew that they were going to get Star Wars by the time that this movie was getting ready to be marketed. I think the announcement came towards the end of 2012. I don't remember. But, they had Star Wars. And they knew they had a sure thing, right? Even if they screwed up Star Wars, which they did, they knew they could make money with Star Wars. So why spend a ton of money on this other space series that's kind of like Star Wars when they have Star Wars? So there was that. But as for the movie itself, there were some great things about this movie, and some things that they got right. First, we'll talk about the cast. We've got Taylor Kitsch as John Carter. Was he a good John Carter? Yeah, he was pretty good. He didn't play John Carter because John Carter was not in this movie, which is one of the problems that this movie had. There was no John Carter in this John Carter movie. Taylor Kitsch played, and he played it very well, he played another character named John Carter in this movie, who was actually very different from John Carter. But that character he played well. So Kitsch was good. Then we have Deja Thoris, which is a tough character to cast. Did they get the right person? Yes, they got Lynn Collins, who was perfect. She was great. Lynn Collins was great as Deja Thoris. And even there were issues with Deja Thoris as far as how she was presented and the red people were presented. But she was great. So Collins was great. Then we have Tars Tarkas with William Dafoe as Tars Tarkas. He was really good. The Tharks in the film didn't look exactly like they did in the book, but they were close enough. So that was good. The one thing that they did really, really well and nailed perfectly was Woola, the dog. John Carter's dog, Woola. They nailed Woola. They got Woola just right. So there was that. But other than these things, there were some things wrong with this film. First of all, John Carter wasn't in this movie. So the character that they gave us as John Carter was not John Carter. They gave us a Hollywood trope, the Hollywood trope of the reluctant hero. They decided to make John Carter a reluctant hero who had, and the reason he was so down and bitter and depressed at the beginning of the film is because he had lost his wife and child in the war, and he didn't want to fight anymore. He doesn't want to fight. He just wants to, live his miserable life. Already you see many differences from the actual John Carter from the books. But then he goes to Mars and, has his adventures on Mars. Now, this character is completely different from the character of John Carter as presented in the novels. And that was the thing that bugged me the most. If there's one thing that really bothered me about this film, it's that John Carter wasn't in it. The real John Carter is anything but a reluctant hero. That's the opposite of what John Carter is. John Carter can't help being a hero. First of all, he's never... He wouldn't be this depressed, bummed out hero in the first place because that's just not his personality. He didn't lose a family during the war. He didn't have one during the war that he lost. He wasn't married, didn't have a kid. He was also an immortal warrior, but that part is ignored. In the John Carter film, he's just a guy, just a regular human being, not an mysterious immortal warrior, as he is in the book. But they just changed his character from a guy who just could not help being a hero. He was just naturally heroic. If there's a fight, he's running to it. He's not, oh, I don't want to fight, I'm bummed out. No, he was there. He would be in the middle of it. That's just who he is. And that's one of the really cool things about this character. And so they just completely changed the character. And that just bothered me. Kitsch did a good job with the John Carter that they presented in the film. I just thought it was lame that they made this really gigantic change. There was the way the movie was told, where we start with this weird exposition scene on Mars where Deja Thoris tells you all about Mars and this and that. And that was completely unnecessary. This is not Lord of the Rings, This is not a story that is so complex that you need a bunch of exposition in the beginning of the story. The way this should have been told is the way the book was told. From the viewpoint of John Carter, you discover Mars and the cultures on Mars and the situations on Mars with John Carter from his point of view. So you should have known nothing until John Carter got to Mars, and then you would find things out. That's how the story should have been told. A lot of needless complexity was thrown into this movie. And part of that was with the depiction of the Therns as this weird intergalactic alien villain, weird intergalactic alien villains, which was completely different than the Therns as they are presented in the books, of course. Another change I felt was kind of needless. The Therns shouldn't have showed up until the second story, if we even got there, right? We didn't. And so as it turns out, we have these characters, the Therns, in this movie when they were completely unnecessary. And we're never going to find out about them anyway because the movie tanked and we never got a sequel. And the Therns, I think, added complexity to this story, which was unnecessary. There were so many changes in this movie from the original story that just were not necessary. If they had just followed the original story somewhat, it would have been really good. But they didn't. I think they had this whole idea about this series. It was supposed to be a series. And so they threw a bunch of stuff in the first film that they could build on through the rest of the movies. God knows what they would have been like. And all of that stuff was, like I said, not necessary. It should have been more like the original story. This is a feeling I have about most adaptations of stories and books and things like that. I think the closer you can get usually to the original, usually it's better. I know you have to make changes. But the problems, it's like the new Interview with the Vampire series, where they made changes and, to make these changes, we have to make these other changes. To make that work, we have to change this. And so you end up with a bunch of unnecessary changes that actually end up making things worse and not better. Another thing about this movie is that it looked a lot like Star Wars. Now, of course, the John Carter series came out long before Star Wars ever did. And a lot of Star Wars is influenced by the original John Carter series. Nobody knew this, however, going into the movie because no one told you, Nobody in the marketing said, hey, this is one of the things that influenced Star Wars. So you go into this movie not knowing that. It seems like this movie is ripping off Star Wars. We have a lot of scenes in this movie that seem very familiar. We had that whole arena scene, which the way it was done, it looked a lot like some of the scenes from Attack of the Clones. You don't want anything in your movie to look like anything from Attack of the Clones, but it did kind of look like that. This film had that feeling. It seemed kind of, the way it was shot, the way everything looked, it all looked a little drab and very much like, even the action scenes and stuff, it looked a lot like those Star Wars prequels that came out a few years before. And like I said, you don't want anything to look like those if you can help it. But they did, frankly. They changed the red people and made them white people with tattoos. This seemed ridiculous. I don't know why they did that. I think there was the feeling that it just wouldn't look realistic if we just painted everybody red. Why? Why not? You could have pulled it off, You could have done that. But they didn't. They decided to make the red people... they had red tattoos, So that made them red people, apparently. One of those changes that was unnecessary. The whole thing was just... It was just, it's okay, And it, like I said, it wasn't a bad movie. It just wasn't nearly as good as it could have been. This movie should have looked completely different from Star Wars. It shouldn't have looked anything like the Star Wars series. If they had filmed this in such a way where in the movie they made things look and happen as they did in the original story, and if they had created the world closer to what Edgar Rice Burroughs had done in the books, it would have looked fantastic and it would have been an exciting story. It would have had a great pace, I think. It just would have been a lot better. As it is, it's not a bad movie. It's just not great. And I think Disney deliberately torpedoed it because they had a surefire hit on the horizon. Why waste time with this John Carter series when you've got Star Wars? And so the marketing was just what it was, and the movie wasn't good enough to get good word of mouth in order to entice people to go see it. It was a dismal failure, unfortunately. And that is unfortunate. There were a lot of things about this movie that could have been a lot better. And as it is, it's just there as a disappointment, I think. Never got the sequels, so we will never know if those would have been better or not. We'll never know. It's just what it is. Will John Carter ever return to the screen? I kind of suspect that eventually that is inevitable, just because it'll probably show up somewhere someday as, like they're making everything now as a streaming series, because everything is a streaming series now. That might happen someday, but at this point, my personal feeling is when it comes to the books that I love and the characters I love, I hope they don't make movies about them. I mean, sadly, because almost every time they do it, it turns out not so great. So I kind of hope that they don't make a John Carter series or another John Carter movie. I feel that way about Conan, they're just going to screw it up, if they make it nowadays. So just leave it alone. Leave alone all these characters in books that I like. They won't, though. But anyway, that's my feeling on this movie. I've gone on long enough. I will catch you next time.